what we are going to do on the prevention cohort is we are going to have a chance to, let's get all this stuff stopped, and we'll start right here. So welcome to the Prevention Cohort Live. We are going to tonight go through Human Trafficking Essentials, the online course that comes along with Radical Empathy's work. My name is Billy Joe Kane, and I'm going to be your guide for today. We're going to spend probably about just 30 minutes in the course, and looking forward to getting your feedback. I expect to see some notes. I expect to see some comments. I expect to see this shared. No, I'm just kidding. If you have any questions, I really just expect that you'll just give me a call. I'm going to go ahead and drop my number in the chat here. It is 512-521-8874. We do these meetings every Thursday at 6 o'clock Central Time. You can join at any time, and then of course we record these meetings so you can watch them as well as a bit of an extra resource for yourself. So what we're going to talk about a little bit today, I'm going to share my screen over here. What we're going to talk about is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so what we do here is we do the best we can to provide you prevention tools, because we really believe that prevention is at the heart of ending human trafficking. We have to stop it before it begins, and we're going to do that through prevention education. And prevention education is what we call preventucation. We really believe that taking traditional education that's rigorous, measurable, and has learned because when you interact with the materials, you remember things better, you have more confidence in what you learn, and you will remember them longer. So we talk about here what we do with our certificate is we have a measurable certificate of mastery so that we can actually quantify what you've learned. So we start off with a pre-course assessment. You're going to see that in the course itself. After the course is done, there is a post-course assessment, and to get a certificate of mastery in our courses, you have to get 100%. And these certificates they're accessible online, and they're also shareable by email. We talk a little bit more here about the course content, where we get the courses from, or where we get the material from, the interactive lessons and activities, the fact that everything is measurable. We talk about our certificate methodology so you can understand exactly how that comes, or how we decided upon that. We talk a little bit about our materials, why interactive learning generates wisdom, why gamification is key to interactive learning, and our belief again is that prevention education is better. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into one of our courses. Our first course that we're going to go through, and this is what we're doing tonight, is Human Trafficking Essentials Online Certificate Course. Now this is the same course that is available on our site as Human Trafficking Essentials Express, as the certificate course and the university credit course. But for the university credit and the certificate course, you spend money, and then the express course is currently choose whatever price you want. So we're going to go ahead and start at the very beginning and choose to start here. All right, so it opens up with a welcome video, and we're going to go ahead and full screen this welcome video.
I'm so excited that you decided to sign up for this course. This course helps you better understand what human trafficking is. Before you can understand what human trafficking is, you need to know the essentials. These include what is human trafficking, who it affects, where it is taking place, and how it affects people around the world. We will also discuss proper responses to human trafficking. To help you better understand these essentials, you will learn the definition of human trafficking, the prevalence, the risk and vulnerabilities associated with human trafficking, and the proper responses when you believe that you have identified somebody who is a victim or in a high-risk situation. After this course, you will be able to better define, understand, identify, and help prevent human trafficking. So once again, thank you so much for signing up for this course. Let's get started.
All right, that is my partner, Dr. David Deeds. He has been teaching this course for a decade. It's divided into 4 chapters. Starts off with the definition, so we know that you know what trafficking is. Then it's going to go into prevalence, so you can find out who this is happening to, where it's happening. Then we're going to talk about risk factors and vulnerabilities, the how human trafficking is happening to people. And then we're going to talk about, last but not least, red flags and responses. These are the things that you need to know how to do. Can you recognize a red flag? Can you respond to human trafficking? And then we finish the whole thing up with a test so that you can get your certificate. So let's go ahead and check out the rest of the course. Now, I'm not going to go read every piece of material that's in here, but the very first thing we ask people to do is to make the time to put the trafficking hotline in their phone. We feel like it is important for you to have access to this, not just make a note of it or remember that it's in the course. We really want people to stop and actually do this. So this is something that we mentioned a few times through the course. Hopefully this will also be a time where somebody understands that it is okay to stop the course and do this. And we're going to go ahead and move on to the next lesson. So the way that our courses are designed is every course starts with a pre-course assessment, so we can get an idea of what you know right as you get started. Now, there's no guilt, no shame, no anything about this trying to ask you, oh, we're trying to prove you don't know something. That's not the case. What we're trying to do is just trying to put a baseline out there so we know at the beginning of our course, we have an average of X number of people that knew this percentage of thing, and when they finished the course, they had average that they knew this sort of thing. These are metrics that we're keeping. We also measure that to see if we're actually doing a good job teaching this stuff, if people are remembering the correct things, if they're getting it wrong at the beginning and then getting it right at the end, etc. So there's a 20-question assessment course. The questions are broken down into the same kind of categories here. So there'll be some about definition, some about prevalence, risk factors, vulnerabilities, red flags, and responses. When you take this course for the first time, you'll get all 20 of those questions. We also added an answer in here. I don't know, but I'll learn it in the course, because we don't want people to feel like they're supposed to know these answers when they get started, because there's nothing wrong with that being your answer. When you take this course for the first time, you'll have to finish this whole thing, and there'll be a timer that's running down here. So we're going to go ahead and just skip it and jump right into we're going to jump right into the next lesson. All right, each chapter starts off with an overview section, and this overview covers the contents that are in this particular chapter, the learning objectives broken out into that exact format, and then questions that you'll be able to answer. Now, these questions are based on the questions that are in your pre-assessment and in your final test for certificate. So if you're wondering where you're going to find the answer for these things, it's going to be inside this chapter. And we don't just tell you the answers are embedded inside of the actual classes. So for this chapter, we'll go ahead and go through this in a little bit more detail. So we talk about, and this is because it's so important to understand the definition of human trafficking. So we talk about national and international definitions of human trafficking, and it boils down to actions, means, and purpose, which we'll describe in great detail. We will explain what is not human trafficking, because there are crimes that seem like they're trafficking, but they're not. And we'll talk about some crimes that intersect with human trafficking. And then finally, the chapter is going to end with a brief activity to test what you've learned. And the idea here is not a test. It's a place where you can practice with the ideas and the new concepts that you picked up. Okay. Learning objectives, obviously the definitions, how to differentiate human trafficking, what other crimes intersect with it, and then the questions that are in the final are right here. We're going to go ahead and skip down to the next lesson. It's going to open with the video. Okay, here we go.
Human trafficking can be difficult to define because synonyms for human trafficking include terms like modern-day slavery and trafficking in persons. Additionally, there are different forms of trafficking, including debt bondage, forced labor, and commercialized sex trafficking. All of this can be overwhelming, and that is why in this section, we are going to look at the two most widely recognized and accepted definitions of human trafficking used throughout the world over the past 20 years. The first definition we will look at is in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, commonly referred to as the TVPA. This act was signed into U.S. law in the year 2000 and has been reauthorized several times, keeping the U.S. definition of human trafficking the same for more than 20 years. Through several versions and updates, the TVPA definition of human trafficking has remained fairly consistent by dividing human trafficking into two categories, labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Let us go over the TVPA definition in detail together. From Section 103, subsection 8, the first definition is sex trafficking. Like all human trafficking, sex trafficking is a commercial act. The TVPA refers to commercial sex acts as any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. This can be in exchange of money, a good, or services. The TVPA also details the three means in which someone can be trafficked: force, fraud, or coercion. Force and fraud are pretty straightforward, but coercion can be tricky. The TVPA defines coercion as threats of physical harm, scheming or planning that would result in the physical restraint of a person or the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. Lastly, the TVPA says anyone under the age of 18 engaging in commercial sex is automatically a victim of sex trafficking without having to establish that force, fraud, or coercion were used. When we look at labor trafficking, it is important to remember that the purpose is not commercializing a sex act. Instead, the purpose is to benefit from a person's labor. Additionally, this is where the TVPA details the actions of trafficking, which include recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, and obtaining a person. Taken together, the TVPA's definition of human trafficking relies on actions, means, and purpose. This is known as the AMP model. This acronym will make it easier for you to define and identify human trafficking. The next human trafficking definition comes from the Palermo Protocol and is widely accepted internationally. Ratified by the United Nations General Assembly in December 2000, its official title is the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. This non-binding resolution acts as a recommendation for 193 UN member states to improve international cooperation to catch criminals and assist victims. Article 3 has notable similarities to the TVPA definition. First, in Section A, the actions of trafficking are defined as recruitment, transportation, harboring, and receipt of a person. The Palermo Protocol's means are identical to the TVPA: force, fraud, and coercion. The Palermo Protocol also includes deception and abduction as means of trafficking. These terms are likely encompassed in the TVPA as means of force and coercion. Finally, while the Palermo Protocol definition does not explicitly state purpose, it instead uses the word exploitation. This is appropriate because all human trafficking involves exploiting an individual. The forms of exploitation include servitude, the removal of organs, and commercial sex acts, which are defined as prostitution and forced labor. While Section A provides the bulk of the definition, Sections B and C are important as well, because Section B explicitly states that the victim being complicit in any acts before becoming trafficked are not considered a mitigating factor in being considered a victim. For example, if someone agreed to be smuggled across the border and upon entering a country found out they were going to be trafficked, they are still considered just as much a victim as someone who was kidnapped prior to being trafficked. Simply put, it does not matter how someone became a victim. What matters is that they meet the condition for being a victim. In Section C, the Palermo Protocol defines all exploited children as human trafficking victims, regardless of establishing the means of how they are being trafficked. This is exactly what the TVPA stated about commercial sex and minors. Now that we have gone through both of these widely accepted definitions of human trafficking, you can see the similarities and overlaps in how human trafficking is defined around the world.
All right. So I look at that video after seeing it a million times, and I'm really excited about it. And at the same time, I'm always overwhelmed by it. It's very difficult, I think, to tease out the meanings of the words action, means, and purpose without playing around with that for a while. So we give you plenty of time to think about that. So what you'll read here, and I should probably, I'll go ahead and stop screen sharing for just a second. What I want to talk about is that one of the things that's important for our course is that we're trying to train people using multiple learning modalities or learning or thought processes and different ways of thinking about things. So you not only get the information provided to you in a video in an instructional format, you'll also get it in an animated format later. You're going to get it in written stories. You'll get the information written as laws, because we never know exactly how somebody's going to pick up on it. And then we also include all these interactive activities as well. So we'll go ahead and jump back into the course. Kind of an example of that. So there's some reading to do here. Action is act of controlling a person's body. Means is kind of what I kind of think about is how somebody is being mean to you. So it's like, how do you make somebody do something? So I'm trying to find some pneumatic device or a word that sounds like the word that makes it feel that way. And purpose is obviously this is the reason, and everything having to do with human trafficking is about income and making money and generating value for somebody else. And that's the P, the purpose of the AMP model. So there's some stuff to read here, a little bit about labor trafficking. You might consider thinking about some of these. How could a cleaning service be used for labor trafficking? How is a carnival or the fishing industry, how can those be used as labor trafficking? So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to read a little bit about what is not human trafficking, and we're going to start looking at a requirement analysis for the AMP model to see if certain activities are actually human trafficking or not. So you can think through it yourself. So here's some overview. Some crimes are confused with human trafficking, and you might even hear them said interchangeably online or in some news articles, but they're not always the same. So human trafficking is not the same thing as refugees, immigrants, people illegally crossing borders, migrant labor. Human trafficking can happen to anyone. We're going to talk a lot about how that happens in Chapter 2. Human trafficking does not have to include sex. Human trafficking is also labor trafficking. So if somebody is making a profit from your body, whether it's your back or if you're having sex, that's trafficking. So another thing that a lot of people don't realize is that human trafficking is happening in America to legal citizens. We'll talk about that later. And this is we sort the source on that. So we'll talk a little bit about the AMP model again. The AMP model requires an action, a means, and purpose. And if you don't have all three, it's not human trafficking. Except if you're under 18, it's automatically human trafficking if something was exchanged for a sex act. In other words, you do not have to prove that they were being forced, frauded, or coerced into doing it. Just the fact that they were doing it at all, that means it's trafficking. So we might ask, why is sexual assault not human trafficking? So we define sexual assault. And we explain that there's no commercial exchange of anything of value during this crime. So if you look at the analysis, yes, they've obtained somebody. Yes, they forced them. But no, they did not profit from commercial sex or labor. So we're expecting people to go through each one of these think about it for themselves, spend the amount of time that they need to figure out why this is the case, because we really need people to understand the definition. So there's a few more. We're going to go ahead and click over to the next lesson, and this is called Identifying Actions, Means, and Purpose. And this is an activity that, now if you've learned all this stuff, we're expecting that you have the ability to jam your way right through this. So let's see. Let me make sure I start with the first one. All right. So these are flip cards, and on one side it talks about a situation, and then it asks, according to the ANT model, are these individuals human trafficking victims? So let's read the story on this first one. Juan Carlos and Sylvia have agreed to go with a man they never met. The man says he can get them into the United States via the Mexico-U.S. border. So these guys are going with a man to get them across the Mexican-U.S. border. So the question is, are they human trafficking victims? Well, willingly crossing a border while violating customs laws is known as smuggling. There's an action where you're transporting, and that fits the definition of trafficking, but the other necessary elements, like means, were they forced, frauded, or coerced into this? Nope. Most likely they paid to get across the border, so they weren't tricked into it. So if you're not tricked into it, that's not even and there's been no means. Now, it also says that there's no intended purpose to commercialize their labor. Remember, they were just crossing the border. It's not saying to get them work. So if there's no intended purpose to commercialize the labor, for action, yes, they transported. But a means, no, they weren't tricked into it, and not for commercialization of labor. So you can see this is it's a pretty good breakdown, and it allows you the time to go through at your own pace, flip back and forth. You can look up here at all the instructions, make sure you have everything that you need to answer these questions. And we have 4 of these cards. One's about Kelly. Kelly ran away from home at 15 years old. After 48 hours, she has no money, no plan, and nowhere to stay. And I can tell you, this is the most dangerous time. At a bus station, a man starts a conversation with her, buys her some food. She hasn't even eaten in a day. So what's happening is she has some vulnerabilities, and he's taking advantage of those. With nowhere to stay, he offers his couch for the night. Well, he could be taking advantage of her, but now she knows her vulnerabilities. So now it says, with nowhere to stay, he offers his couch for the night. He's nice. He buys meals for 2 weeks. She cannot believe her luck and tells him she appreciates his generosity often. Then he says he's running out of money, but he knows how to keep her off the streets. And so Kelly says she'll do anything. He says he has friends willing to pay to receive sex. She's never done anything like that before, but she agrees to and does it. Does that make her a victim of human trafficking? Let's take a look. So Kelly performed a sex act in exchange for something. So that's an action. In this case, it was money, which establishes purpose, right? So she needed, the act was for purpose of money. And then anything that exchanges a value for sex is considered a commercial act. And since she's a minor, that already qualifies as sex trafficking without having to prove means that she was forced, frauded, or forced into the act. So this guy provided her for sex. Means is not even important because she traded sex for money. So this is the way you have to think about the definition of trafficking and whether an action is in fact trafficking or not. So here's a couple of extra things for you to think about. How could the ANT model apply to potential trafficking situations at truck stops or brothels, peddling, begging. We're going to go ahead and now we're going to be moving on to chapter 2, which is prevalence. Where is this happening? So in the contents here, we're going to talk a little bit about statistics, about where human trafficking is happening, kind of forms of trafficking there are, some real life accounts, and then a brief activity to try out some of the stuff that you've learned. We're going to learn about significant number of forms of trafficking. You know, we talk about the actual dollar figure of the sex economy throughout the course, but the truth is that it's not really about knowing the exact money or exact dollar amounts. It's about knowing that it is very large. So I just want you to think of the scope when you're going through here. So some of the answers are here, or some of the questions that are going to be answered are here. We're going to go ahead and start with the next video.
Human trafficking is a worldwide problem that affects an estimated 40 million people, according to the International Labor Organization. These victims generate $150 billion in profits for human traffickers around the world. Victims suffer in multiple forms of trafficking, from labor trafficking and sex trafficking to more than 15 million people who are trafficked into forced marriages worldwide. While people do not need to be moved or transported to be considered victims, there are many who are transported, and some are even transported to different countries. The United Nations Global Report on Human Trafficking for 2018 identified 124 different nationalities that were forced, frauded, or coerced into Western and Southern Europe for the purpose of trafficking. Looking at the United States, we find more than 95 different nationalities that are being trafficked into the country. Within the U.S., the Department of Justice secured more than 500 convictions for human trafficking in 2018 alone. While these convictions are encouraging, estimates suggest that there are at least 50,000 people trafficked into the U.S. every year. And while 50,000 people being trafficked into the U.S. is incredible, it might surprise you to know that more than 4 out of 5 identified trafficking victims are U.S. citizens. Importantly, human trafficking victims are considered a hidden population, so these estimates may be less than the real number of victims in the U.S. Those trafficked into the U.S. and those who are trafficked within the U.S. borders suffer in at least 25 different forms of trafficking. These include individuals being forced, frauded, or coerced into construction work, hospitality, magazine sales, forced begging, erotic dancing, pornography, carnivals, agriculture, domestic servitude, illicit massage parlors, forced prostitution, and more. It is not as important to remember all of the forms of trafficking that take place in the U.S. as much as it is important to know that there is such a diverse range of ways that people are being trafficked. The range of ways that someone can be exploited is what makes it possible for human trafficking to exist in so many places. In the U.S., human trafficking is taking place in some areas more than others, but human trafficking exists in some capacity within every state. Since being created in 2007, the National Human Trafficking Hotline has identified more than 63,000 human trafficking situations across the country. The states that have the highest rates of identified human trafficking cases include California, Texas, and Florida. Even within the states, there are cities that have more human trafficking than others. Studies from the Urban Justice League and other organizations have shown that the underground sex economy of major cities in the U.S. ranges from 30 million in Denver up to 810 million in San Diego. These major cities will attract higher rates of sex trafficking as girls and women are forced into prostitution in the underground world of commercial sex.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if this is going to be useful if people decide that they'd like to just take the course right along with me. I thought about that. Maybe we should have said that at the beginning. So here's something that's really important. The statistics that you're going to be reading constantly about human trafficking are never going to match up. They're just not. There's different studies that have different purposes, with different levels of funding, different outcomes in mind when they begin, and you have to remember that that affects everything. And the other thing is that this is a very hidden crime, and so people are really just making their best guesses on a lot of things. So, we try to keep everything in here current. If there's something that you find that needs to be updated, let us know, and we will fix it up. We change things all the time. Let's see. So here we go. This is going to be a little bit about victim demographics, like who is this happening to, and then a little activity to kind of see if we can make sense out of this data. I've been told this chart is not the greatest, and I will apologize in advance, but I know that the answers are in here if you play around with it long enough. So we talk a little bit about the things that were just said in the previous thing, like the number of people that are being brought into the United States every year to be trafficked. Make sure that we know that the hotline is here. This is the thing that's important. The size of the underground sex economy can range from $30 million in Denver up to almost $1 billion in San Diego. Now, these are estimates, but just thinking about the amount of money that can be made in these cities by these traffickers, it's outrageous. So this chart really tries to show, if what type of trafficking has certain features. So when it's sex trafficking in America, it's a majority women. There are still men that are being sex trafficked, but the majority of them are women. Labor is generally men. And for sex, it's a majority of United States citizens. And for labor trafficking, it's a majority of foreign nationals, the people that come over here for labor for work legally. The majority of sex and labor trafficking victims are legally in the United States, and neither of them are being forced. So it's like they're being tricked into it in some way. So force is not an issue. But fraud is when it comes to labor trafficking. And coercion is when it comes to sex trafficking. So people are tricked into labor trafficking, and they're like psychologically manipulated into sex trafficking. The best numbers that we can find is that an average age of when victimization begins in America is 17 years old. Again, with the studies that I was just bringing up, you will see a lot of different stuff. And the truth is that even after we've done extensive research that it's up on our knowledge vault, we've done tons of research on it, and the result ultimately is that really we just don't know because the studies haven't really been done. We need large, comprehensive studies to be able to determine that. So I would just say it shouldn't be anyone ever being victimized. So let's try to work on ending this stuff. So it says when the victimization for labor trafficking begins, it's 22. So for sex trafficking, it's 17, but for labor trafficking, it's 22. Again, these studies, really need to be rerun. So the way that this quiz works is it's a true/false for some of the answers. Yeah, this one is all true/false. You're just going to be trying to select the best answer you can. We are not keeping scores or anything like that. So when you see that your answer is correct and you'll see a star, that's a good thing. So let's see. Women make up the majority of identified labor trafficking victims. Well, I know that's not true, but let's take a look up here. So who is the majority of labor trafficking victims? Labor trafficking victims. The majority is men. So let's see, women make up the majority. No, it is false. It is men. Let's check it out. Yep, got it right. Majority of identified victims are legally in the United States. Let's see, identified victims are legally in the United States. Majority of both. There it is. Is it true? There it is. The 3 means of trafficking, etc., etc. I don't want to do your quiz for you. And then we ask a question here. You know, these numbers are staggering, even if they're off by any number of factors. Does your city or state fund survivor-centered shelters? Are there enough free healthcare services in your area to handle the incredible needs of people that manage to escape these bonds? I want you to think about how your communities, are working together to help with this. We need all hands on deck. So we're going to go ahead and skip on to the next lesson. This is going to be a video called Victim Stories. Here we go.
We've covered quite a bit of information, including worldwide and national prevalence estimates, different trafficking types, and some victim demographics. Now, let us take a look at what this all looks like in the real world. To do this, we're going to look at 2 real-world accounts of human trafficking, and while these real-world accounts are not meant to cover every instance or way that somebody can be trafficked, they do help to illuminate the ways in which people are brought into trafficking and how they continue to be trafficked without us recognizing their victimization. The nonprofit Polaris found a majority of labor trafficking victims identified in the U.S. are legally in the country with work visas. Daniel's journey to becoming a labor trafficking victim started when he applied for and received an H-2A visa. This visa allowed him to work as a farm worker in the U.S. The fact that he became a labor trafficking victim while legally being in the country as an immigrant is not uncommon. Daniel was also paid less than he was promised when he acquired the visa. Leaving the situation was difficult because the employer took Daniel's passport and the nearest town was very far away. Additionally, like so many others, Daniel's visa was tied to his employer, so if he left the farm, his visa would be invalid. He worried this could impact his ability to legally enter the country in the future. Daniel wrestled with the idea of reporting the abuse or allowing the victimization to occur, because he did not know what else he would do for work. In the end, he and some of the other laborers were able to contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline, who worked with federal authorities to free Daniel and the others, and ensure they were paid all the back pay they had kept from them. There are somewhere between 2 to 3 million migrant workers and farm workers in the U.S. These individuals include illegal and legal workers, and while farm worker populations vary regionally across the country, overall 78% of farm workers are Hispanic, with about 95% being of Mexican descent. Keisha's story is much different from Daniel's, but she too was a victim of human trafficking in the United States. Her journey to becoming a trafficking victim started when she was placed in the foster care system at 10 years old. Keisha ran away from her foster home for the first time when she was 14 to avoid the sexual harassment she was experiencing from one of her foster family's relatives. Out on the streets, Keisha was tricked by a 26-year-old man who offered to get her back to her biological family. To financially support getting her back to her family, the man told Keisha she would have to engage in commercial sex with several of his friends in exchange for money. The friends Keisha was expected to have sex with for money turned into anyone the man chose. Keisha was forced into prostitution and eventually was arrested for solicitation and then returned back to her foster family. There she suffered more harassment and again ran away and called the only person she could think would help her, the trafficker. Forced back into prostitution, Keisha was arrested again, but this time, while being held in juvenile detention, she was able to work with an outreach group and share her story of victimization in the foster home at the hands of her trafficker. She was able to go to a residential program out of the state and able to work towards her GED and a life where she would not be exploited into commercial sex ever again. Keisha's story is unfortunately a common one, repeated by many girls around the United States. The National Runaway Safeline reports that between 1.6 million to 2.8 million youth run away each year, and many sex trafficking victims are runaway girls who were sexually abused as children. 1 in 6 of these runaways reported missing were likely sex trafficking victims, and of those, 88% were in the care of social services or foster care when they ran. This problem is so prevalent that the FBI estimates more than 100,000 children are victims of sex trafficking every year in America alone.
Okay, we are back. All right. Yeah, both of those stories, they had positive outcomes, and it is sad but true, but they are the exceptions. Many people do not have good outcomes, and that is why we are here, to try to prevent people from having bad outcomes. All right, we're going to go ahead and go to the next lesson. You're doing great, by the way, for staying on with me. All right, here we go. So this is a word drag. It's a little bit different than the previous things. And you just put your cursor on it and click it and drag it, put it into the correct slot. You can always check your answers. You'll get a star if your answer is correct. And again, there's no ongoing score to worry about. We are just practicing with our knowledge. So let's see, trafficking effects around. Well, this is kind of easy because it's just a number, not a Texas. So let's see, Texas around 40 million people worldwide making only money, so 150 billion annually. And the goal here is to get people to actually think about how these things work together. So this is the only one that you can figure those first three out pretty easy. Now it's like, all right, so I remember that Denver was smaller than San Diego. I remember that from earlier. And even if I needed to go back, I could go back to it, because that's fine. And then I just check the answers. Hey, look at that, I got them right. And you can do the same thing here. And then once you've completed that lesson, we're moving on to Chapter 3, Risk Factors and Vulnerabilities. All right. I think this is going to be it for tonight. We are going to do Chapters 3 and 4 next week. And I look forward to digging into the rest of this. I'm going to stop sharing. And wow, it's a lot, I know, but if you can get all of your staff to go through this as training, it's going to be amazing, because when you hand out courses or let the public have access to the thing as well, you will know exactly what kind of things they're going through. It does not require you do not have to know anything about human trafficking to hand somebody the link to this course. The course contains everything somebody needs, as resources if they need pointers to resources. We also have a whole lot of other goodies online that are available, tons of resources, tons of articles, access to lots of curated information, with a huge knowledge vault with almost 5,000 articles there right now. And if you need us for anything, just give us a call. My number is 512-521-8874. Feel free to text or call anytime. You can get a hold of me through pbjlearning.com/contact if you want to set up a meeting. And we can talk about anything, anytime. Well, I appreciate you being here. Believe in yourself, and we will see you next time on Prevention